Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey, and I'm here with Jason, the deer. Jason, Neil Patrick Harris, Johnston Yellen. And, you know, we've tried to focus season 9 on us going out to visit distillers, visit blenders, you know, visit the people that we want to talk to and that we aim to talk to. But fuck if Down Under isn't far away from the east coast of America.
There's a reason they call it Down There.
That's right, down there. But we've got two lovely people with us from the Archie RØDE Distillery. We've got Dave Withers and Fish. I know you buy fish. What's your full name on the birth certificate?
David Fisher.
David Fisher.
Hence the Dave and Fish.
Are there any other Davids down there at Archie RØDE? We've got 2 on our screen right now. Are there more roaming around the distillery?
We do. I thought you were going to ask if there are any more Davids down under for a second there, but yeah, we seem to collect Davids. So yeah, I'm Dave. There's another David, and there's Fish, and I think that's it. There's the 3. Yeah. So yeah,
there you go.
We can't all be in the same room at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
You'll see too. We've actually sent one across to New Zealand at the moment.
Keep your distance.
That's actually a part of what I want to discuss is that New Zealand connection there. But before we get to that, I'd love for you guys to just introduce yourselves and give us an overview of Archie RØDE. You know, we're thankful that we've got a number of listeners down there, but we also have a number of listeners up here who may not be so familiar with you. So it'd be great to get to know you a little bit.
Sure. I'll try and keep this fairly concise. Yeah, we're a distillery. We've been going since like 2014, which seems like a long time ago, but at the same time was here just an instant ago. Yeah, it was a bit of a different landscape when we started out. So in 2014, it was kind of a bit of a landmark year for Australian whiskey. It was the year that Sullivan's Cove won World's Best Whiskey at the World Whiskey Awards, which was a massive deal down under. Like, it was all over, all the press, everyone was talking about it. And so we kicked off 2014. There were about 24 distilleries in Australia at the time, some big brands like owned by the likes of Diageo and so on, and then some really, really small, like, probably 20 of those 24 were like tiny distilleries. And so it felt really important when we were opening the distillery. And, we started fairly small, on sort of craft scale. And we sort of opened out in a suburb fairly close to the CBD called Rosebery. And it was really about we had a bar, we had experiences, we had tastings, we had all that sort of stuff. It was really about trying to convert Australian drinkers into spirits and whiskey, because a lot of Australians have this kind of thing that sort of beer and wine and so on is, it's part of our cultural heritage and all the rest of it. Like, we drink a lot of beer, we make a lot of great quality wine, which we export, as well as consume locally. But people just sort of like, spirits, that's not Australian. Like, why do we make Australian spirits? That's crazy. And it was
something we buy from America, mixed with Coke.
Checks out.
And so for us, it was really important to kind of take that on. And for me personally, I mean, I'm just a nerd about this stuff, but we actually have like this ridiculous history of distilling in Australia. And, I won't bore your listeners by going through it, but effectively it was legal to distill in Australia before it was legal to distill in Scotland. Up until World War II, one of the largest whiskey distilling countries in the world until World War II. And yeah, we made a bucket load of spirit. And it was
whiskey
yeah, whiskey was a big part of it. Also rum, gin.
That checks out.
And so, yeah, it's part of our cultural heritage. I mean, if you look at it, so Sydney was a colony, and the first hospital built in Australia was built on the rights to distribute rum in the colony. Before we had currency, it was spirits that were traded as currency. So it's actually part of our DNA as a nation. And we kind of ignore that a little bit. We kind of think, just wine and beer. But sort of started out with a fairly small distillery. We actually thought it was huge at the time. It was like double the capacity of like the nearest sort of largest competitor, I guess. And we just ran out of space. We ran out of capacity like immediately. So by 2017, we were just looking at the writing on the wall. We hadn't even released whiskey. We'd brought to market white spirits, and those were just outstripping our capacity, and we just knew we were going to have a problem. So we started building our new distillery, which is probably a whole nother story in itself. So I'll probably like cut it off there and probably let Fish tell a little bit of his story. Yeah.
Fish, before we transition to you, Dave, you mentioned something that I'd heard in listening to one of the videos on the website, which is close to the CBD. And for us up here, CBD means something else.
It usually goes with THC. It's that, right? You connect the two.
You know me. What is CBD that you're using in Australia?
That's your downtown.
Yeah, it's like downtown. It's a central business district. So, it's kind of the center of the action.
There you go.
Gotcha.
CBD sounds great.
Cool.
Though.
Thank you. I didn't want to...
I'm so glad you asked. I didn't want to come off stupid. It's like, okay, CBD, gotcha. All right. Well, that's good.
Yeah. We've got lots of funny...
Really forward-thinking Australians.
I didn't mean to cut off the transition to Fish, but it was a good time to get that cleared up. So, and Dave, you're the master distiller at Archie Rose.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's correct. and then Fish, you are
so
master blender, sensory dude.
Yeah, so my official title is the senior spirits blender. Essentially, what that means is
seems a bit harsh.
You can't see the back here.
Solar panel.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, it means I lead up the blend team. Yeah.
Gotcha.
We're a team currently a team of 4, and next week expanding to 5, actually.
Oh, congratulations.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And I know you've been around the world. In giving a little bit of your background there, can you cover a little bit of the travels? Because I want to come back to them later in our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know you've got travels and then and I'd love to hear about this second distillery.
So Dave, while he was here busy working away and getting this beautiful business up and running, I was gallivanting around the world, doing all sorts of wild things.
All right.
Going like right back to the start, I was a bartender and went over to the UK after university and got pretty serious into the bar world over there. And that's where my real love of Scotch and the big brandies of the world really developed. You get such great exposure to it over there in Europe. We get some here, but nowhere near the same. And then I returned back home to Australia, did an engineering degree, then worked as an engineer for a little while. And a friend of mine poached me back into the hospitality world with the lovely dangling carrot of opening a bar and a restaurant over in New York.
Okay. That's where New York comes into this.
That's the New York thing. And he knows me quite well. I actually grew up on a sheep farm here. So dangling New York City in front of someone who, grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere was a pretty easy win for him.
Uh-huh.
And so then moved over to New York, had the bar and restaurant. That was just before COVID times, so we were open for about a year. And then COVID shut that down pretty quick smart. And that's actually where I first met Joshua at a tasting. I think he was tasting Impex spirits up there.
At Skurnick's offices or whatever, the
that's the
distributor.
one. Yeah,
there you go. Yeah,
their love of Calvados was a parallel that just worked so well for me. Yeah, stock take was terrible at my bar. And then obviously, so COVID happened. We stayed there for a little while. I was working for a group over there, but the writing was on the wall there for my wife and I. We decided we wanted to move back home, and a friend of mine was actually working at Archie Rose, and they were just about to transition to the new distillery. And we're looking to build the sensory team. Exactly right. So Dave and I actually had our interviews like this over the interwebs. We did some virtual tastings together where we both bought the same products and then, went through nosings and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
David was crazy enough to take someone with zero productions like skills or knowledge or experience. And I was crazy enough to take the job. And that's how it all started.
I'm curious for you, Fish, listening to somebody have a bar experience, then an engineering degree, and then another bar experience that brings you to this sensory position. Are there any crossover skills there? Was there any part of this where you were like, this benefits this? I'm really curious.
Yeah, massively.
Interesting.
So I think what doesn't get talked about a lot on the blending side of things is the actual management of stock that goes into blending. So obviously the purer part of blending is nosing a glass and deciding which elements you like and in what ratios.
Yep.
The whole background that feeds that is forecasting liquid from off the still into barrel when you're going to pick it to start analysing whether you want to blend it, and then what happens, what you haven't blended, and what happens to all the other products that you're creating, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting.
So all of that side of things is my engineering degree.
Sure.
And all the nose in a glass things is the hospitality side.
Yeah,
so it's actually worked out very well.
Yeah. I mean, for New World blending, for like New World distilleries, it's kind of like this crazy dark art, because there's this kind of like melding of just super analytical, methodical kind of work and just complete who bloody knows, that's really the stuff. It's as I can, what Fish is kind of describing, and he's like simplifying it a lot here, is, we have so many different types of new make. We'll get into that in a minute, but on the day-to-day, we make 9 different types of new make. And so then you've got all these multiple different streams. How do they come together into these multiple blends and so on? How do you manage the stock? Then how do you understand what's going to be available when? So then you need to do some statistical analysis to look at like, okay, we're going to have some of this come online at a certain point in time. But then once you get the barrels and you've done all this methodical, meticulous, database-driven stuff with a lot of maths and formulas and all the rest of it, then you get these glasses in front of you. And if you combine 2 of them together, they might cancel each other out, or they might create something new. So you might have this situation in which 1 + 1 = 3, or 1 + 1 = 1. And so that's the crazy thing about how we do things in the kind of the new world. Because if you're sort of in the old world, you have a history you can draw on. You have recipes you've inherited. You have systems and processes, but we're kind of coming at it fresh. So that's kind of to add a little bit more color to what Fish was sort of saying there. It's a pretty interesting skill set.
That's pretty wild. It has me thinking about Matt from Nickneen, who also came from hospitality. He came from working a bar, and he's in charge of their blending. And I love that, right? 2 New World distilleries there that are taking a mixologist's approach to blending, which is new and it's fresh and it's different. And Dave, not Fish, but Withers, to your point about 9 different new makes. I mean, I imagine that then grows exponentially with the number of casks that you have available to you as well. So
yeah, you see the problem.
Yeah, right. So you need an
flash opportunity.
So Liz, I definitely want to discuss this new distillery, but seeing as we're talking about flavor and flavor creation, let's get into some nitty gritty. Where does the idea start? Does it start from a flavor profile you aim to make because you were inspired by, insert inspiration here? Or are you looking at what's in your inventory to see, okay, what are the components available, like a chef would be when they're looking in their spice rack, So how do you approach this?
Yeah. I think to answer that, we probably do need to get into how we do distill things, which is a bit crazy. So I might take a sidebar and on that for a moment.
It'll come together really well.
Yeah.
All right.
So I mentioned before our original distillery in Rosebery, we started distilling there. And again, kind of in Australia, we're in a bit of a vacuum. There was this whole craft whiskey movement happening over in the US. We didn't see any of that in Australia. Occasionally you would get a friend that goes over stateside and would grab a bottle and bring it back. And so you'd see a Corsair and you'd be like, oh, this is what's going on here? This is a funky label. This is pretty cool stuff. Yeah. But it was all kind of a bubble. But we sort of started out, we're making whiskey in what I'd describe as an Australian whiskey 101 kind of way, which was, there were kind of stills made in Australia, we were using brewer's barley, it was sort of, there was kind of almost a set recipe or formula that people were kind of following at that time. I didn't like that because I didn't understand why. Just didn't understand why. And, people were making stuff and, there was this kind of myth at the time that oh yeah, we use brewer's barley because brewer's barley has more flavor. And I was like, okay, cool. Have you guys tried anything that isn't brewer's barley? And, people wouldn't go into it. The reality was that we have so much beer in Australia that was what was available. There wasn't a distiller's barley available in the same way there is in Scotland. If you're in Scotland and you're a Scotch whisky distiller, you can buy distiller's barley. And if you're a big brewer, if you're Tennent's or something like that, you can buy brewer's barley. And there's a big difference. And so we started looking at this and we started saying, okay, well, if we basically, what happens if we go and use a distiller's barley? That's going to give us more alcohol. But it also, maybe there's a sacrifice in flavor there. And the big thing for me, I got into whiskey about 15 years ago. And my background's in wine. So I grew up in a family of winemakers. My father's a winemaker. My grandfather's a winemaker. And the provenance is king. Provenance, vintage, variety, that's king in wine. You pick up any bottle of wine that's cheap and up, and you're getting a vintage, you're getting where it's from, you're getting the variety that it is. And those are pretty important details, right? So when I would go to these amazing talks from Scotch whisky distillers, you're tasting these fantastic Scotch whiskies, just absolutely fantastic. And there'd be these branded, this brand ambassador at the front with a kilt, just selling you the dream, you're you're drinking these whiskeys and you're in the rolling glens of, Speyside, and you feel like you can smell the freshness of the air and the maritime, if you're by the coast and all of those things. And then me being the weird nerd that I am, I'd raise my hand and say, so what about this grain thing? Wine, that's important. What's the deal with the barley? And weirdly, you'd inevitably end up in this conversation about yield. And I just never understood that. I was for me, it just made no sense. I'm here I am being ripped away from the rolling glens of Scotland to talk to some accountant's office to talk about dollars per lal or whatever it is, right? It just made no sense to me. And so when we started out, it was that whole idea of brewer's barley was something that we just wanted to draw on. And so we started experimenting. We started looking at different types of grain. And what we landed was, both through our rye whiskey and our single malt whiskey, we kind of uncovered some really cool things. And I'll go on a little bit of a journey for the rye, because I think this kind of was the epiphany point. But when we started out in 2016, kind of looking at these grains really, really carefully, I came across this craft maltster in New South Wales. There's a mob called Voyager. And they were fifth-generation farmers that grew up on the property. It's a tough life being an Aussie farmer. We faced drought in many years, and, it's tough. Yeah. But they really felt a sense of pride in what they produced. And they, for a lot of farmers, they spend an entire year producing this crop, which at great risk, drought, flood, whatever. They could end up with nothing at the end of that year. Yeah. And that product that they end up with ends up just going to the town silo and sort of getting sent out into the universe. That they have no idea what the grain that they've produced, what it actually goes to produce. So these guys are really passionate about using alternative varieties to kind of drive a sense of provenance and kind of uniqueness and flavour. So they came across this variety. They picked it up in what they kind of describe as the equivalent of a sort of farmer's yard sale, right? And so they got a ton of this stuff for about $50 Australian, which is nothing. And they kind of planted it and started growing this rye, and we kind of picked up on it, and it was pretty cool. It was really interesting. When we ran it through the distillery, we were at that time importing rye from Europe, because no one was making malted rye in Australia. That was just not a thing. So we couldn't get it. So we wanted to go local. We wanted to support people. So we started using this rye, and just the flavor difference was just so profound. All of a sudden, you had I wouldn't say generic, but quite mild flavors from the imported stuff, very subtle, very, easygoing. But this rye had it had ginger, it had spice, it had eucalypt, it had all of these really cool things that were just so different. And so I remember calling up Stu from Voyager and saying, what's the deal with this rye? Where's this come from? And he started telling me about how they found out that ton of rye that they bought had come from one farm in outback New South Wales. And the farmer had grown this rye year on year on year for the better part of 70 years. And that might sound pretty ordinary, but no farmer does that. What happens is every 5 to 10 years, they update the variety, and, you refresh the seed you're using. If you grow something year on year on year, what happens is that variety starts to adapt. It starts to mutate and take on different attributes. So basically what you have is this variety that's adapted to the microclimate of this town called Sandigo, and is its own thing now. It's its own unique, what they call a land race variety. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so that was the epiphany moment for us, where we went, actually, if you look at the variety and you look at the way it's grown and the place it's come from, there's something really powerful and unique that can drive flavor here. And it's something that we should really investigate further. So at the end of 2016, we went out to Voyager for the harvest, and I remember standing in a field, in an Australian field in central New South Wales, like in the middle of nowhere, and there's like the red ochre earth. Like, I don't know if you've seen shots of Australia, but it's just that rust red.
Yeah,
the sky is like the deepest blue. Like, you don't get that kind of blue in Europe. I've not been to the States, so I can't speak to the States, but you don't get that kind of blue, I think, just about anywhere else in the world. There's eucalypt trees, just like a native Australian variety, just like lining the field. It's 45 degrees Celsius. Like, hot.
Everything's melting. Yes.
Yeah. There's like snakes like running through, like, this is Australia, right? Like, and I just had this moment where I'm standing there going, how can anyone think that whiskey made from grain that comes from a field like this is the same as grain, the same whiskey that would come from grain grown in Scotland? If we were harvested in Scotland, we'd be wearing 5 layers. We would be like,
it's not 45 centigrade.
It'd be wet. It'd be like, it'd be all of those things. And so for us, there was just this moment. So anyway, we started looking at all these different grains and these different varieties. And for our single malt, we came up with like effectively a mash bill of 6 different varieties of malt that we wanted to use. And for our rye, there was 3 different types of rye that we wanted to use. Each one of those grains, each one of those malts gave a unique flavor. So that's both looking at variety, looking at different like roasting or kilning techniques, all of that. Okay. And I'll like just remind everyone, 2016, in Australia, we didn't know who Westland was. We had no idea. We didn't know that anyone in the States was using specialty malts. We'd never heard of that, right? Uh-huh. So this is purely in a bubble. And it also wasn't a bubble. A lot of people are like, oh, cool. So this is like, you're really influenced by the brewing industry in Australia and stuff. No. This is purely like whiskey nerdery. We were just trying to drive flavor in whiskey. It's not taking something from brewers or wine or anything. We were just, trying to make something really cool in the whiskey space.
Dave,
just
a very quick point of clarity. When you say 6 malts and 3 ryes, is that then a 6 malt mash bill? You're not distilling the 6 malts separately, maturing them and then bringing those together. Okay,
they do that.
You're looking at me like I've stepped in too soon.
No,
you're about to get
great.
to this.
Sharp as always.
Thank you for that question, Jason. So the problem we had at the Rosebery side, and we made some great whiskey there, but the problem you have when you do that is you make some compromises. So I'll give you as the classic example here is if we're using like a sort of pale or distiller style of malt, we're doing that to try and give fruit and floral flavors. We're driving that sort of flavor profile. If we're using something like, a variety we call like Voodoo, we're using that to create cereal. So like malty, biscuity, baking, that kind of stuff. So if we just look at this still, right, if I want the fruity flavors, I'm going to cut on the spirit still early. But if I want the cereal flavors, I'm going to cut late. So now all of a sudden I've got a problem because now I'm kind of, on average, only getting a bit of fruit and a bit of cereal. So when we started building the new distillery in 2017, we wanted to solve that problem. And we decided to do something pretty crazy, which was to effectively separate out each one of the different malts into their own stream. And so we designed a process where at every single step, we can like just nudge the flavor profile further in the direction we want. So again, I'll give you an example. So if we look at our sort of pale malt, again, that's that fruity floral flavor. Mm-hmm. The way we mill it, the way we mash it, the temperatures, the sparging, all of that sort of stuff, the yeast we use, the fermentation time of the yeast, the way we wash distill it, the way we spirit distill it, the cask entry strength, and the type of cask we use. Every single one of those steps is designed to maximize the fruit. If we're looking at, let's say, that cereal I was talking about, that sort of, cereal profile of RØDE, the way we mash it, the way, like every single one of those steps, we're pushing it further into making it a more cereal-driven style. Gotcha. And what we end up with is, when you mature all of these different malts separately, is we end up with a color palette in the back where we can say, you know what, we want a spirit that has quite a lot of fruit and only light cereal. Okay, great. So let's adjust the profiles and the percentages and ratios to do that. Or if we want something that's really pushing like the grain, we can do that. And that's kind of, that's the complexity that fish is faced with on the day-to-day. And also, it's a lot. And it's also the ability for us to really work it. Again, there's a parallel in wine with all of this. I mean, if you're a Bordeaux winemaker, that's how they do things. It's not, you buy Bordeaux, it's not one variety. It's like an assemblage of different varieties, all from different fields, all from, produced separately and then back blended to give complexity and consistency year on year.
This is terrific. I definitely have a question based on what we're discussing, but it also feels like the perfect moment to transition to fish and have fish pick up this thread on how do you manage this in sensory perspective, a lot of things going on. Well, what does that look like for you as you're given a task, a remit, a goal? Talk to us, Fish.
Yeah, so it's, as Dave kind of mentioned, it's quite complex. So we'll probably just take some snapshots to kind of make it easy. The main piece here that is like the big part of the engineering side. We don't have 200-year history of blending notes and recipes, and if this happens, then use a bit more of this. If this happens, use a bit more of this. We're building that on the fly.
Yeah.
So that's where the analytics comes in. So we take a really proactive approach with the production team on tracking the flavor profile through the process and then off the still. We then align those at points along maturation. So we're essentially building like an analytical model of the flavor profile and the development. Right, so there's some translation there of like what's in the nose. You have to kind of zoom out a little bit to make it so that you can actually analyze.
Yeah.
But that's the first piece. So that's a piece of trying to like accelerate our knowledge of the spirit. Then when it comes to actually creating the spirit, it's a combination of you get a remit and we give like the possibilities, let's say. So there's a really great collaboration between all the teams here on, okay, production team, what is possible?
Yeah.
What are some cool ideas? What's looking great out there? What isn't? What needs more time? And then we start to dig into, well, also, what is Archie Rose? What do we stand for? And again, we've got great flexibility. We have core products where you're designing to a flavor profile. And from that, it's like there's pretty firm edges.
Can I just right there really quickly, two-second question. When it comes to creating these core products and understanding you've got clear parameters to be working with, is it easy enough to say, oh, there's my recipe, 2% of this, 3% of this, and boom, there you go, right? Do you allow yourself, right? Wouldn't that be lovely?
Both guys shaking their heads.
Do you always allow yourself a little bit of wiggle room?
Yeah, so we have a few like practical methods to like force that little buffer.
Yeah.
So we do what is in common parlance called Solera, but more accurately called fractional blending.
Yeah.
So we always keep a little bit of one batch that follows through in every blend. So it's not a true Solera like, in Spain.
Yeah.
But there's a commonality of actual liquid that flows through all batches. Now, of course, it's diminishing returns, but it flattens the noise a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And yeah, just on that. So like basically if you build a tank, let's say, I don't know, 10,000 liters of liquid, what we're talking about is you take 5,000 liters off and that'll go get bottled and we'll reserve 5,000 liters in that tank. And that is the seed for the next blend. So it's it's actually a cognac technique, and we started it right at the start. It means that at worst, like we'd never get here, but at worst, you're only 50% different to last time.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I guess that's a really short answer of that.
Yeah.
That was 2 seconds, right?
Yeah, 2 seconds. There you go.
Yeah. Just to return to your question for a sec, Josh, like I realized I didn't fully answer your question just before. You asked, like, what's the seed point? Like, when we go to create a new product, is it like, where does that start, right? Yeah. The answer for us is we try to, we get excited about a lot of things, and so we have a bit of fun as well. But at the core of who we are and what we do, it's about the grain. It's like telling the story of the malt. And for me, again, when I got into whiskey, it was just this thing I had to wrestle with and question. It was, if everyone wasn't talking about grain, they were kind of avoiding this conversation about grain, and even, if you got these like great bourbons and so on, sometimes they wouldn't tell you what the mash bill was. They'd say, hey, but there's like, all these grains are really different, but we're not going to tell you what they are, And
Yep.
I remember like trying to ply with drinks, like some master distillers from like Kentucky, and just like after 20 drinks, just nothing, just crickets. But the thing for me that it really always struck me was, the sense check on that just made no sense, because the grain has to matter. If the grain doesn't matter, then why does whiskey taste different to cognac? Why does it taste different to Calvados and rum? So there's something in the grain that is so fundamental to the flavor of whiskey. And so that's what we try and do. And what that means is that sometimes often we start from the grain. So when we want to release a product, it's the conversation back with the farmer. It's the conversation back with the maltster and saying, what have you got? What can we get? Because my philosophy with this is, we talked about, all of these different types of new make and so on. This is not an academic exercise. This is not about like, we're proving that, there's like some hypothesis and it's like not a scientific experiment here. When we take that grain, we're taking it into the distillery and saying, what are you trying to say? As a grain, what are you trying to express? Mm-hmm. And so again, I'll like land on something like RØDE. It's trying to express its like maltiness, right? And so we're custodians of that. We're taking it into the distillery and saying, I'm going to try and get out of your way here and make sure that I can support you through every single step to showcase that in the spirit. Because my philosophy is that great whiskey does not start its life in the distillery. Great whiskey starts its life in the field. And so when we go to try and produce something, it's about making sure that farmer's toil and that land is being able to have a voice in the whiskey.
Yeah.
That makes good sense. I love your passion and your belief in that. I enjoy hearing as well, Dave. For you, Fish, you answered the question far too quickly, my dude, and I'm going to come back to you. Take for example, because you kind of glossed over that you get the remit and then you start building. So let's put some leaves on those branches. Please fill out your center bingo podcast square there. Looking over the website, I see this collaboration you've got with Sydney Opera House, and the box is beautiful. I love the design on that. I love the description. You're talking about honoring classical Scottish and Japanese, methodologies. The color is beautiful. We're not color guys. It's a beautiful color, right? When Archie Rose, the powers that be, come to you, Fish, and say there's a collaboration with Sydney Opera House, talk us through that. How does that look for you, your team, the distillery, as that gets built?
Yeah, there's probably two levels to this, and part is more in Dave's kind of world.
Perfect.
Which I'll let Dave speak to on his own, but I'll give a little touch on it. So what I was saying before, there's a very collaborative piece. So it actually would start as, let's say for that example, Sydney Opera House as a partner. What options do we have from a liquid point of view conceptually? We'd like to put something out there. We have no idea what it's going to be. Hit us. And Dave and I will go away. We'll get the distillery manager, pull in the rest of the team, and say, like, what are some ideas? It might flow out to the rest of the company. What are some ideas? It all kind of comes back together. There's a bit of looping there of, is it possible from a production point of view? Is it possible from a numbers point of view, etc.?
Sure.
Yeah.
Once it eventually lands to me, we've already had some input and kind of inceptioned what I want to do and what Dave wants to do, So the color of it may have changed, and, conceptually the way that it faces outwards might still change. But at the core, it's from where Dave's coming from, which is, what liquid do we have that is expressing well, that could also align well with the partnership or the release concept or whatever it may be.
Sure.
Then we get into the actual nitty-gritty of, hey, is this contemporary versus classical? And then we get the fun of going through the spreadsheets and going through the stock. And, for that, we probably screened, I want to say, close to 4,000 barrels. It's wild. That's regular.
That's regular.
Yeah. We've got a pretty gun team of noses. That also gets fed back into all those spreadsheets as well. So we never miss a moment to put data into, our system. But we then whittle it down into flavor camps and, making sure that we're expressing what we need to express. And then it gets quite fiddly. It's, complex spreadsheets with micro pipettes, and, it looks pretty fancy. At the end of the day, it's the nose. It's whoever's leading the blend with support from Dave. If it's not me leading the blend, myself, and we just work our way through. And sometimes it's 13 iterations and, chef's kiss. And sometimes it's 113 iterations and it's keep rolling.
Wow.
Yeah, it's we're very driven to get it right. We will not cut corners. So, for instance, in that one, I actually had to reblend one of the products, not in the real world, but in the lab, about 4 times. And each one was about 40, 50 blends.
Yeah. I think the other thing as well is, I've got a few things to say about this, but it's quite
We are like-minded in our duration of speech.
Yeah.
I think there's like just something crazy about that blending process. It's you're effectively taking something which is like so subjective, like you can't put easily a number to it. But Fish and his team and myself, we have to take that and put a number to it and like quantify it and make it like real and tangible and sit in a spreadsheet. And then you have to be able to translate that back into something that's completely intangible again. And so it's that how that works that's quite unusual. I mean, Fish and his team actually went out to the opera house and like took in the atmosphere in order to sort of understand to a certain extent what they were blending to. When they were blending the classical, they were playing classical music from the opera house when they were blending it.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of, again, this fusion of kind of art and like science that just is, you know, really, really fundamental to it. Yeah.
Just seems like a radical proposition to bring up this collaboration, but then to see the way in which music fits in and just very quickly, and then I'll give the floor back to Joshua. I would assume it's like writing a book or writing a poem or something like that. Like there can't be a platonic ideal for the blended product that becomes the Sydney Opera House blended product. And so when do you know to stop? When do you know that's the version that'll go to bottle?
I like that.
Yeah. There's a quick answer, which is when Dave says yes. The slightly more long-winded answer. From our point of view, there's a few different markers, right? You're getting into the window, and we kind of talk in windows. You get in the window reasonably quickly, and we'll play within the window. So, like, we're in the bounds of what's acceptable. We get in that window pretty quickly, but we'll sit there for a long time to really make sure that we're capturing what we want to capture from a flavour point of view. Mm-hmm. And we'll also go down lots of different flavour routes and options and make sure, like, it's the null hypothesis. It's definitely not that one. And it's definitely not that one. And it's definitely not that one, you know? Currently, it is still this one, you know? And we'll get to that point, and Dave's actually great at this, not for my timesheets, but he will also be like, are you sure? Have you tried this and this?
Oh, wow.
All right, I haven't, so let's go back and check it, you know? And sometimes you can go a little bit further. It's that classic, you know, hey, everyone put your hand up as high as you can. And now put your hand up a bit higher. And everyone always gets a bit higher, you know? It's the same thing. Sometimes it can get better. Now it's incremental.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, you can always get that little bit more.
That's right.
Yeah, I definitely think knowing when to stop is like a really important thing. I think if you don't know when to stop, you can go too far and it can look worse. And I feel like often when you reach a point where it's as good as you're ever going to get it is when any move you can make from that point actually reverses the quality.
Yeah.
That's, you know, you've hit the absolute sweet spot. But we also take quite a methodical approach. So what we're talking about is kind of like new product development. So like Big Blue Sky, something like the Sydney Opera House or something like that. When we look at like our core range, it's much more specific. So what we do is we will put up a blend. One of the blenders will put up a blend, and they basically, in their opinion, this liquid is identical to the last batch, right? Identical or better. And how we know that is we do what's called a triangle test. So what it is, and I always struggle to describe this well, but there's 3 glasses. And there's 2 blends in 3 glasses, which means 2 glasses are from one blend and 1 glass is from another blend. Does that make sense? In Josh's
absolutely.
No, I got you. I'm just doing math on the fly.
Josh is taking his shoes and socks off to pull this off.
Let's not go to 21 here, though. Okay.
20 and a half, please.
Go easy. All right.
So what that means is one is not the same as the others, but you don't know which one and which order.
Yeah.
We do that in triplicate. We do that in triplicate. And if like a trained sensory panel of 4 or 5, if I'm available as 5, soon to be 6, go through that and they can't spot the difference, no customer is ever going to spot the difference. Mm-hmm. Then what we do is we go through and say, okay, but we might not spot the difference, but if we do spot the difference, is it a better blend than the last one? And so then we have some tests to look at, well, okay, you might not have made the same thing, but is it a better thing? Because if it's better, that's going to be the thing that we use to check against next time.
Yeah.
And so it becomes, again, very like methodical because we're trying to like iterate here. We're trying to develop it. Yeah. The amount of sampling we do in that kind of way is just phenomenal. Every single bit of spirit that comes off the still, every single bit of spirit, it goes on a panel. And so for new make, for example, we've got all these 9 different new makes. So all of a sudden, you can't just like put a new make on a panel and look at it and go, yep, smells and tastes good, all ticks. That's hallmark Archie Roses. It's like, okay, but there's like 9 hallmark Archie Roses, right? So what we've got to do is we've got to have this like what we call an attribute difference test. So we look at this and go, okay, this glass in front of us, we need to give it a score out of 5 on an 11-point scale for fruitiness, for solvent, for cereal, for smokiness, for all of these sort of attributes. Mm-hmm. And then we take that offline and we look at, okay, is the shape of that the shape that we want the spirit to be? So if we're trying to make something that's super fruity and it's like it's a delicious spirit, but it's not fruity, we've got a problem. We've done something wrong. Yeah. And so we need to then adjust the process. We do that for everything. We also do that for finished products where we're looking at the attributes of the spirit and saying, okay, does this fit the brief that we want it to fit? And what is the quality score we assign it as a result?
Yeah, it's an in-depth process. I'm very quickly curious, how often do people nail the triangle test?
It's a bit of a fun one within the team because by the last person, you know what they have to score for a pass or a fail because it's cumulative, right? So everyone's like, waiting with bated breath. But everyone in the team has different strengths. Mm-hmm. So you will see, like, there's almost always one person who will call the difference on everything.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, they'll nail it. Like, and then for that, you're like, oh, what did you see that was different? And they'll say, it was this marker. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. That's their strength, right? Whereas it's my like weaker space, right? Whereas in other blends, it's like right in my wheelhouse and I can see all the little nuance. And for me, it's blindingly obvious. Like, I'm literally looking at everyone like, are we looking at the same glasses here? Like, that's
fascinating.
Like, it's so obvious. Yeah. But then the next time I do it, I'll get none. And I'm like, time to bring that paycheck down a little bit.
don't volunteer that, Fish.
We're in a safe bet, right, guys?
Yeah.
No one's listening to this. Don't worry.
No one. Yeah. All you thousands of people, turn your stereo off. Listen, Dave, you had mentioned before that in creating these 9 different spirit types, it wasn't easy to do with your first distillery. Building this new distillery allowed you the freedoms to do just that, to mash and distill nine different spirits. So can we talk quickly, because we're starting to run out of time here, but don't look at the clock. Can we talk about what this new distillery is doing that the old one couldn't, to make what seems like an incredibly daunting task of creating 9 different spirits that much easier? And I know part of its capacity is as well. So what is this new setup doing for you?
That's a great question. And if you ever want to feel the urge to get on a 23-hour flight to Sydney, I'm happy to show you around. It was a big scale up for us. I mean, when we started at Rosebery, it was like, it was craft whiskey styles, right? Everything was manual. It was like, we had this, dodgy old mash tun. It was just a Wild West adventure for a few years there. When we started building the distillery in 2017, we got some of the best Scotch whiskey distillery engineers in the world. And then they struggled to deliver the complexity of the project. We had to get a new project engineer, and it was a journey. To give you an idea, the previous distillery had a capacity of 150,000 pure litres of alcohol a year, which is not tiny. That was I think at the time, that was around what Kilhoman was producing on Islay. Okay. So it's not that tiny, actually. Yeah. Our new distillery has a capacity, we don't run it at this, has a capacity of 3.2 million pure litres, which is, that's more capacity than Lagavulin. Yep. So, but we don't run it at that. And just to kind of contextualize that though, Lagavulin makes one thing, right? We make 9 things. And so we're kind of like a huge craft distillery. But to do that, we needed some pretty fancy kit. So we actually use a mash filter on our site here. So Jason's nodding his head and Joshua looking like I just spoke Chinese to him.
I've heard those 2 words together.
Yeah.
I've heard them separately, but not together.
Video. Yeah. The website is a treasure trove of information. It's phenomenal. Highly recommend it.
I'll explain it a little bit. So most distilleries use what's called a mash tun or a semi-lauter tun. It's very traditional. It really they add a lot of, bells and whistles and technology to it these days, but essentially it hasn't changed in a few centuries, right? From sort of traditional Scottish distilling. We can't do that really easily because rye is just a pain in the neck. And so when we make rye, we're 80% rye, and it's just a punish. It's a tough day out. And so we needed this mash filter technology. It's actually from a Belgian mob, and they're pretty cool. They've actually had this technology since the early 1900s. So it's actually, got a bit of heritage and what have you. But effectively, it's kind of hard to describe, but there's kind of like a plate, and all the plates kind of stacked together in a giant sandwich. You could think of a sandwich of slices of bread, 54 slices of bread. And what you kind of do is you take the mash, which is the sort of grain and hot water mixed together, and you kind of inject it between the slices of bread. Mm-hmm. And so on one side of the slice of bread, you've got a screen. And so what happens is the wort, the sugary liquid moves through that screen, and we pump it out. And on the other side of the slice of bread, you've got what we call a membrane. And what that means is you can actually inflate it and squeeze the grain against the other slice of bread or the other frame. Does that kind of make sense? Mm-hmm. So what it means is we get this ridiculous amount of yield. Now, I'm not going to try and, after all my passion, take you back to the
Well, there goes my question. Thank you.
But I look at it, here's the passion piece, is I look at it and go, well, again, if that farmer has spent that whole year creating that grain And it's some like ridiculous, like we process some amazing grain here, varieties that were grown in Australia in the 1800s and, just with terrible, terrible yield. And if we take those expensive, amazing, flavoursome grains, the least we can do is get as much out of it as we can. So we get on the regular about 109% efficiency, which means...
Wow.
Which means we're like nearly 10% above what you could do on the small scale. So that's a pretty important bit of kit. We also, everyone loves talking about the stills, right? So let's talk about stills for a moment. So we have two beautiful stills. We use a cooling jacket on the neck of the still. So we came up with this in Rosebery because our kind of Tassie made, our Australian made stills were maybe a little bit too short and squat for the style of spirit we were trying to make. And what we wanted to do was increase the reflux so that we had the ability to kind of create more aromatic, fruit-driven styles. So what we started to do was we actually adjusted the still, we cut it up. God, that is a nerve-wracking experience. It's like cutting up your still and like looking at the internals of it. It's horrible. But we put this neck jacket on there, which means we sort of pass cold water through the neck of the still and we force the vapors that are rising through it to redistill and return to the pot. So doing that means that you get this lightness. And so the way I talk about it is the stills we have now are like quite short and squat. So if you think about in Scotch whisky terms like Macallan, short, squat still, like this makes a robust style of spirit, right? One that stands up to sherry casks and 20 years in barrel and all of those things that we know Macallan and love them for, right? If you increase the reflux, it's like you're extending the neck of the still. So that's kind of like you start to get into the realm of like Glenmorangie, floral, fruity sort of style of spirit. And so what we can do is we can actually adjust the amount of water we pass into the still, the amount of reflux, like how short or tall the still neck is for the different type of grain that we have. So,
wow.
So for the fruity ones...
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like from a nerdy point of view, we're like just making it taller and shorter.
As you were starting this off and saying what that does in effect, I first started thinking, why didn't you just make taller stills? And now, right, flexibility, creating different spirit types. So sorry, this is really,
but also
really
a temperature-controlled reflux ball, right?
Yeah.
It's fantastic. You mentioned Kilchoman again, right? That's really cool. Enough industry folk listen to this podcast. I don't know anybody using a chilling blanket to elevate and de-elevate their still. Do you know of anyone else doing this? Do you believe you're the only ones out there doing this?
I think there are some that kind of do some similar things, but what no one does is they don't do it on their wash still and their spirit still, which is what we do.
Oh.
Because
Gotcha.
here's the thing is, and I'll try and make this as least technical as possible. The first time...
Dave's very technical, by the way. So he's being very kind to you guys.
We've come this far.
I spend large amounts of our conversation just writing down things to research later.
Nodding your head. So go on, Dave.
If the first time we distill something, that makes our low wines, right? So we take like the fermented unhopped beer and we distill that. We make low wines. That's like about 50% of the liquid that goes into the second distillation. Because obviously the second distillation, you're recycling your fours and feints from the previous distillation.
Yep.
So if you haven't made the flavor you want it to be in that first distillation, you're like hard up against it to make the flavor in just that second distillation. Mm-hmm. So I take the perspective, we've got this great system where we can adjust the reflux, we can shorten or extend the neck of the still but it wouldn't it be great if we could do that both times we distill it? And that works pretty well for us. And what it means is we're not talking nuances. Like we get big swings in the sort of flavor profile that you can't get coming off the still, and big swings in ABV. You know, we can get up to a new make spirit of like 80% alcohol, really high. You know, that's almost like triple distillation kind of strength.
Yeah.
And get all the way down when we're making like a smoky style of whiskey to like, you know, the kind of 60s. So yeah, it's a big window. Yeah.
Man, you guys are doing it. There's no doubt about it. Gosh, we could have a part 2 with these chaps once we fly 23 hours to Sydney with Jess and our luggage.
Exactly. So just last question here. What does the next 5 years look like for you guys? What are you most excited about?
I might start and then I'll let you answer, Fish. I mean, the big thing for us is I think we're kind of a well-kept secret. And so now the big thing for us is we've got all of this liquid. We've been making it in pretty decent volume for a number of years. And now it's time to take it to the world and kind of show them what Australian whiskey can be. You know, we have an amazing heritage that we kind of need to like own up to and kind of show the world what we can do from down under. Make those farmers proud, but also make whiskey drinkers from Australia proud of what we have. And I think we've got, you know, a pretty unique product. So that's really the exciting thing to do next, is to get over stateside, get into EU. We're in kind of a few export markets locally, but it's really to just take that next step up.
Yeah, makes good sense.
Yeah. I mean, I pretty much been paralleling
Fish
that.
continues nodding his head in front of Dave.
Yeah. well, I mean, Dave nailed it so well, right? You guys have said it, like, we're really going all the way. Like, we're not trying to hide. We're trying to make a statement. And, you know, I'm just excited for that statement to be made from like a liquid perspective. All this liquid from the new distilleries coming online, and it is awesome. Like, it's what I get to see behind the scenes is amazing. And, you know, I have to pinch myself that I get to work in like 20 distilleries every day, you know, because we're blending all these different whiskeys. We also make gin, vodka, rum, brandy, you know, like no one gets that. But now we get to actually put that liquid out there. And it's really exciting, like, to show off all this hard work.
Are there more hours in an Australian day than there are in an American day?
We start very early.
I don't know how you're doing all this.
We're currently 4 hours into our shift. It's 10 a.m.
And it's what, 10 a.m. for you chaps?
10 a.m., yeah.
So, wow, 6 a.m. start for you on a Wednesday morning?
A couple of drams in early just to get the day started right.
There you go.
Well,
get primed. Yep.
Before we fully wrap this chat, this entire interview, you Fish have been downing from a novelty-sized hip flask. And every time you lean back with two hands and take a big swill, I have to assume that's your water bottle.
It is my water bottle. It does kind of look like a flask.
It's a flask. It's a total hip flask.
It's designed to fit in your bag, so it's flat.
Or a really gigantic back pocket on your work jeans.
It's also got stealth technology, as you can see.
It's insane. Does that have its own Wi-Fi connection?
Gets through customs, no problem.
All right, before we say goodbye to you, just really for our listeners here, thanks as always for tuning in. If you want to reach out to us, if you've got a question or comments or what have you, you can email us info@singlecastnation.com. At some point in time, I don't know when that will be. It could be this month. It could be this month, 3 years from now. Our questions at One Nation Under Whiskey email will be revived. But until then, info@singlecastnation.com. Fish, Dave, Withers, Fisher, thank you both so much for joining us. We really appreciate the insight into Archie Rose and hearing about a distillery setup, a blending setup, just an operation that sounds unlike anything else we've ever heard. So it was really, really fascinating. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been great.
Cheers, lads.
Cheers.